everybody. I think we'll wait just another minute or so. Kate, are people still coming in?
I don't see anyone else in the waiting room at this time, but
Okay.
we can still wait a minute if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the materials. I at least have to exit the full screen. Actually, let me look really quickly who's here. Okay. Okay, I am going to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's TIP project cost ad hoc committee meeting to order. This meeting can be accessed virtually through the Zoom. This meeting is being recorded. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Kate White, MPO staff, at kwhite, WHITE, at ctps.org or 857-702-3658. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Participants can mute and unmute themselves. To participate in the discussion, please select the raised hand function. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raised hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. Presenters will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Again, if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Kate White via the chat box or kwhite at ctps.org or 857-702-3658. So I'm Eric Barassa. I'm the director of the Transportation Department at MAPC. And I'm going to just do a quick roll call. Is John Romano from the Highway Division here?
Yes.
Thank you. Is Brian Kane from MBTA Advisory Board? I don't think so.
I am here. I am here, Eric.
Brian's here. Great. Thank you, Brian. Len Diggins from RTAC.
Present.
Thank you, Len. Jim Fitzgerald from City of Boston. No. Jay Monty from Everett.
Here.
Thank you. Peter Pelletier, Town of Medway.
Here.
Thank you. Tom Bent, City of Somerville.
Here.
Jen Constable, Town of Rockland. Okay, it's not here. So, great. Okay, so we are now going to jump in. The first agenda item is public comments. Are there any? Does anyone wish to make a public comment? Just raise your hand if you'd like to. I am not seeing any. So we're going to go to agenda item 3, which we've listed as an action item. Oh, this is summary of the meeting minutes. Is that right? Approval
That's
of
correct.
the meeting summary. Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the meeting summary?
I'll make that motion.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. All those in favor, do I have to do a roll call, or can I'm looking to our parliamentarian. Do I have to do a roll call of everyone?
So we do.
We
Well,
I
Roisin,
can
do you want to go?
Yeah, I believe open meeting law for virtual is all votes have to be roll call.
Okay, great. I'm going to, I'm going to do a roll call. John Romano,
Yes.
Ben Muller,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
Len Diggins,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's everybody. That motion passes. Thank you, Kate. Agenda item 4. We're going to discuss the initial draft programming policies. Matt Genova.
Great, thanks, Eric, and good morning, everyone. So I've got 2 short presentations for you today, which are both designed to facilitate some additional dialogue on the components of a draft TIP programming policy that this committee will recommend to the full MPO board for consideration later this year. The goal of this first presentation is to discuss 3 of the policy interventions that have emerged as front runners over the last 3 meetings of this committee. This agenda item will be followed by another discussion on some additional policy changes that this committee may want to consider outside of those components included here in the first presentation. So based on this committee's meetings thus far, 3 ideas seem to have emerged as key components of a revised set of TIP programming policies. First, the MPO's new TIP programming policy may require that projects reach a more advanced design status prior to project programming, such as having an approved set of 25% design plans or some other similar threshold. Second, a new policy may want to create additional touch points between all TIP stakeholders to ensure clear, timely, and proactive communication around project progress, deadlines, and challenges. And third, a new set of policies may include the establishment of a process for rescoring projects when they experience cost or scope changes beyond a specified threshold. So I'll move through each of these 3 ideas on the following slides. And I'll also highlight that there's a memo posted to the MPO meeting calendar that outlines each of these elements in more detail. So if you don't already have that pulled up, feel free to go ahead and pull that up for reference during today's conversation.
Matt, before you move forward, can I ask, do you want to go through all of these and then have kind of general discussion, or do you want to talk about each one individually and then have kind of discussion and questions after each one?
I could actually, it might work well to pause after each one. So basically the way I've got this set up is to just talk briefly about the recommendation. I've got some questions for consideration for each of them. And so I could stop there with those questions.
Okay. And then just to be clear, I think the expectation for today is not that we actually take a vote or formally approve everything. I think what we're looking for is a general sense of sort of like consensus agreement on the direction. And then the direction would then be for staff to actually like write down on paper, like what the recommendation is, and then send that out. And then at the next meeting, discuss that. And ideally at that next meeting, we would then take a vote depending on the comfort and consensus of where we're at with folks.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So the goal today is really to say, do these 3 ideas, do they seem like the broad outlines of where we should be heading? And if so, then yeah, staff could come back with more detail on each of them, probably a more fully fleshed out memo similar to what's posted today, just more detail. Yeah, so I think that's a good framing. So thank you for that. So with that in mind, I will go through these just sort of one by one. And then again, we'll pause after each of them for a quick discussion. So the first recommendation here is to consider changing the required design status of a project at programming. This proposal would set a higher threshold for project programming than what is currently required by the MPO, which is just that projects be approved by MassDOT's Project Review Committee prior to having funding allocated to them in the TIP. The recommendation here is to raise this threshold to at least having a MassDOT approved pre-25% project scope and cost estimate but could certainly go further than that to require fully approved 25% plans or the completion of a design public hearing, which would be even one step further than an approved 25% design. One of the goals for today will be for this committee to really weigh the pros and cons of setting a higher bar for project proponents for project design prior to programming. So a possible complementary policy change here could involve the formalization of a process for project proponents to have their projects scored by MPO staff prior to advancing design. This would provide project proponents some guidance on how likely their project is to receive MPO funding before a proponent invests significantly in design. And I'll just say sort of for reference that this is a process that doesn't really happen in a formalized way right now. So project proponents may reach out to MPO staff and say, hey, we're considering this project. What do you think? How do you think it would score? So the recommendation here could, if this committee wants to pursue something like that, could be to formalize that policy and sort of make it, a little bit clear that it's an option for all proponents. So in considering a policy change like this, there are sort of at least two key questions for consideration. Really first is, what is the appropriate balance between flexibility and certainty in the project selection process? So again, what are some of those trade-offs of setting a higher bar for municipalities, but creating more certainty for the MPO? And where do we find a good balance point there? And then second, what, if anything, should be done for project proponents that need additional support to reach 25% design? So that's a theme that's come up a number of times, is that we don't want to box out smaller municipalities or municipalities with fewer planning resources. So should the MPO consider creating some sort of complementary guidance or support system to address those concerns? So with that, I will stop there and we can open up for discussion on this, this first one.
Len.
So I'll toss in another question, Matt, and that is, and this is kind of something Brian had brought up, I think, a couple of meetings ago. To what extent is it that proponents come to us as the only way they can get their projects funded?
Is that a question you'd like me to answer? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So typically, when a proponent comes to MPO staff saying that, hey, we've got a project that we're interested in pursuing funding for, most, if not nearly all of the time, the TIP is the sole source of funding for capital funding for that project. Outside of obviously municipal contributions for design and permitting and right of way.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. That was good. So unless you want to say more, I got the information that I needed.
I guess I would say, the way that we fund transportation infrastructure is basically, cities and towns pay for it with their own, resources, Chapter 90 mitigation funds. We use our federal dollars. We use other state resources like the Mass Works, program. That's kind of, and then obviously there's like the sort of the private contributions through mitigation, which I think I mentioned, but those are sort of the main reasons. But for most cities and towns, like a kind of a big complicated, project, the MPO is one of the main sources.
Right. So I went back and I read actually the minutes from the September 15th meeting, and even more importantly, the ones from September 15th in 2016. And they're a pretty interesting set of minutes. To a certain extent, it's almost as if someone recorded some of the meetings that we just had. But the October 6th meeting was also interesting in that the MPO at that point concluded that we weren't going to really ask municipalities to put up more money for design. And I thought the rationale was pretty good for that. And so it'll be interesting to see what we decide. But more importantly, David Mueller, I'm sorry, the current chair, had said that they were discussing this whole issue in the Capital Planning Committee of MassDOT, and that they were working on a policy. Does anyone know what happened with that? I mean, did a policy come out of that?
To ask
Right.
cities and towns to put more money into projects?
Well, that they were just going to come up with a policy of how to handle, I mean, this issue with I mean, I think partly regarding what more capital maybe or money municipalities should put up, but also how to maybe handle this cost increase issue that we are dealing with, because apparently we've been dealing with it for a while. Okay, all right, I have an answer on that. I'll chime in with Dave here and see if anything came up. Because I mean, I would be happy to search through the board's minutes if I could find them. I haven't looked. But I'll look around and then maybe ask David, because it's okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Len. Brian Kane.
Thank you. Just to quickly respond to Len's question, that might be in relation to the GLX funding that Somerville and Cambridge put forward, Len, and that could be specific to that context.
It was.
Those communities did contribute, and then ultimately got their money back from MassDOT when additional funds were made available. So I'm not sure. I think that might be kind of a unique thing. I know MassDOT is considering getting municipalities to put more in, or at least they were until everything changed. I don't know where that is at the moment. But to sort of get to the questions here, if I might, the appropriate balance between flexibility and certainty. Obviously, I would like to lean more towards certainty. However, at 25%, you can't be as certain as you would like. So that really is kind of a technical, I believe, almost an engineering sort of call that I do think the highway folks do a good job on. And so I don't think the issue that we're trying to really solve lies there. Clearly, there are issues where the highway department puts additional scope or cost onto projects, and we've talked a lot about that. So I guess I would lean towards more of a 25% 0.9 as opposed to a 25% 0.1. Not that helps much. And then, yes, something should be done for proponents that need additional support. I think we all agree on that. I just don't know what that support is, or how we would do it, or how we would pay for it. And Eric, just to circle back, I think what I meant when talking about other funding sources was also the transportation bond bill, and sort of finding a way to push some of these things that direction, more of a political process as opposed to the MPO process. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Jay Monty.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree. I think with Brian's comments and others here who suggest I think the 25% design is probably a better point in the design process to really understand where the project sits cost-wise. It certainly is not perfect, and certainly there are often cost increases beyond that point, but the bulk of them certainly happen before that. Like Brian, I think it would be worth looking into how we could support communities to getting to 25%. That said, from our perspective in Everett, we've routinely brought projects to 25% MassDOT design, without any intent of them necessarily getting federally funded, simply because it's best practice. And if we want to apply for other grant programs, or if we don't know if we're going to apply for federal funding, it's a nice benchmark to have. I think it's less of a burden on the urban communities as it is on the smaller outlying communities. So I certainly want to hear from those folks, how this affects them. And then again, I'd like to see what can we, the MPO, do to find some level of assistance for those folks who would struggle to bring a project to 25%.
And can I just ask a clarifying question for Matt and also Jay? Like, we're talking about the 25% submission, not the approval, correct?
Approval.
So what would approval being?
Like you've done the public hearing, and okay. and then MassDOT signs off and says, yep, this is the 25% design, and now you move towards 75%.
So I think I'd say the submission, right? So you take the project to all the appropriate design development criteria for 25%, the cost estimate. And maybe at the point, again, this is just my spitballing at the wall here. At that point, if the project becomes approved on the tip, you would be able to immediately move forward with a design review here, a design hearing.
Because there is this problem where sometimes the MassDOT staff don't give attention to projects until they're on the tip.
Right.
So there's kind of that balancing act as well. And maybe we could, I know Tom Bent, you have your hand raised, but maybe we could hear from John Bouchard and then John Romano on this topic, since they've just raised their hand. John Bouchard, could you weigh in on this? You're muted.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I thought I hit unmute, but as Eric just stated, from Jay's comment, if a project is not programmed for funding, if it's not in a tip year, then part of our policy is that it's I don't want to say it falls to the end, but it's just we work towards a schedule based on where a project is programmed. So current year and first year projects have like a 30-day review cycle. Projects in years 2 and 3 have a 60 to 90-day review cycle, and projects that aren't programmed at all, it's based on availability of staff to conduct the review. Highway is willing to work with the MPO on trying to establish policies that will work within that framework. If a project isn't programmed, it's just we're trying to work with. We're not going to work on something that doesn't have a likelihood of going forward. And we, on occasion, get projects that have not been programmed, not only Boston region, statewide, that can be, wish list type projects, and where do they fall in priorities for that particular region to be in years 1, 2, 3, et cetera. So we try to, assign staff and assign reviewers based on that, schedule and programming. A couple things, though, as I said, we would work with the MPO if there are, if we need to make some updates to some of our policies, we'll certainly explore that and report back. We did in the last year, the last 2 years, we've been looking at our review schedules, and where projects would be, greater than 90-day review, if they weren't programmed or they were in a future year, or they were greater than 90 days. So we've brought them back into the 60 and 90-day window for review if they're a future year project, but at least they're listed in the tip, knowing that, funding and other, fiscal constraint gets applied as the project is moving forward. I think one of the things I wanted to say about cost is that although the MPO finds this an important element to looking at to the project, MassDOT feels the same way. We're looking at cost and scope changes on a regular basis, and we've been putting measures in place to address that. We've instituted a new engineering directive over the last 6 months, whereas project we need to have a pre 25% design scoping with the community, with the designer, and with our internal team, and from both district and from Boston office, to look at the scope for a project that's been approved by PRC, to really establish what the project scope and cost is going to be. What happens, I think Matt Genova went over, I read through some of the notes over the last couple of meetings, the ones that I was unable to participate in. And there was the greatest change in cost was before, was from PRC to 25%. And I want to comment on that at PRC, although MassDOT, Highway, we do a review of the project to program it and bring it to PRC for approval. We don't conduct, a cursory review. We look at the benefits, what the project is trying to achieve, and we rely on the initial submission, whether it's a project need form or information, and the cost is programmed based on the input that has been provided. And then when we receive the project at 25% design, that's really the first engineering, detailed review that we conduct. And then we see, well, they didn't account for this and they didn't add this and they didn't, this wasn't included. And that's why the scope change or the cost change from pre-PRC to 25% is so significant, because at PRC, we're looking at the benefits of the project, how it fits within the program, and based on the cost that has been offered by the proponent, to say that, yes, this is a project that we would support and be able to, be able to get behind. But unfortunately, the cost at that point is, kind of like get the thumb up and say, that's what it is, and it takes a little more detail to get to a more accurate cost. So that's why we've instituted that pre-25% design scoping, bring the proponent in, the designer, and several of our MassDOT, highway staff from both Boston and District, from projects, from traffic, from utilities, and identify the elements of the scope that really need to be factored into a project. So that way, when we get to 25%, it's more realistic, and the cost is more realistic to what was originally, what needs to be done. So that way we don't have that significant cost increase in surprise after that point going forward.
So John, in your opinion, do you think the right compromise is the 25% submission? Or what do you think is the right compromise level of having enough detail that we think the cost estimate is not just a finger in the air, but it's not such a burden that there's been a huge amount of time and investment, and maybe MassDOT isn't, putting much time into it because it's not on the tip yet? Like, what do you think is the right compromise?
Well, I think 25% is a good, is a good indication of fundability, constructability, permittability, that kind of stuff. So that's a good milestone. Any future years obviously become, I think they call it, what do they call it? Illustrative, for projects. It's just that, in those year 5, they're starting to look at projects and saying, well, we're going to list these, but we really don't have a good handle on what they're going to be. Boston MPO has an abundance of projects. Some MPOs don't have that backlog. They don't have that, bench of projects. So when a project is not going to go forward, they don't have something to fit in within that window. So that's why they have to be, we have to be more stringent on some of their on their reviews and on the programming in other regions, because they just don't have the listing and the backlog of projects. Whereas if something in Boston, if a project was going to fall off because was going to fall out of a current year, there's usually an abundance that we could accelerate. And I say we, as in the MPO with MassDOT, we could find a project that we could move into a current year and make some shifts to fill any gap that we might create. And that's just because of the volume of projects that are in the Boston region. And other regions just don't have that listing of projects. And, we work with Franklin they generally have like 1 to 2 projects every year. And if for some reason, due to permitting or right-of-way or some other constraint can't get done, it's a huge problem. And we have to find a way to address that and keep it in the current year as best we can, or we end up with a MassDOT sponsored proponent project that is not necessarily achieving all of the goals, but is something, so we're not losing the funding in that region for that, for that particular year. So I do think 25% is a good measure, good indicator. We are working at the Highway Division on trying to control the scope creep and the cost increases, and doing that by advancing with a pre-25 investigation. So that way, when we get it at 25, this is a good project. It meets all the needs, and we're not making significant changes after that point. So I do think 25 is a good point, Eric. Sorry, a little long-winded on it, but it's just, there's a lot of factors, as you know, that go into this.
Thank you, John. Let me just call on John Romano now quickly, and then Tom, I'll get to you afterwards. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Eric. So a couple of things. So first, I agree with John Bashad that 25% is the right place. I also feel that, the 25% design public hearing is the first time that the community at large is kind of weighing on and, presenting potential community related concerns, issues, or desires, if you will, which also may change some of the scope of the project. Maybe not in every instance, but in at least enough of them. So, you got to keep that in mind as well. The other thing, another way to look at this, and I had kind of brought this up before, is that if we think the burden on communities is too big to get to the 25% design before we'll put it on the tip, then we need to look at that, the project as presented at the PRC level. When it gets to 25% design, it's not a cost increase. We just have to account for that when we program it on the tip. You can't say a $2 million project that becomes a $4 million project had a 200% cost increase. We have to acknowledge that these projects are going to go up in scope until they have the scrutiny that John just described to us, right? So either we go to 25%, we wait till 25% design and know that we have more of the stuff that we want and a better number, or if we want to worry about some of the communities not being able to take projects there, then we have to accept the fact and build in and maybe not program as many projects right away and leave the money available to cover the additional costs, because we know they're coming. We keep being shocked that the number increases. We should not be surprised that from PRC to 25% design, money is going to go up, cost is going to go up on these projects, because it's inevitable. It's like,
Yeah.
God, what happened?
Right. Okay. Thank you, John. Yeah, those points are I think are right on. Tom Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, after listening to John, it kind of changed some of what I was thinking about earlier. But I think one of the things, it would have been helpful if we knew this a little bit when we first were going into this, but some of the things that he talked about was having that pre-scope before the 25%, I think is key, because as Matt has in the draft here, the biggest increase, like John said, is 28% between, zero, that's the biggest increase is after the 25% pot on cost. So I think having MassDOT provide a pre-scope ahead of time so that the proponents and their engineers or consultants or whoever understand what MassDOT's going to require for this project, I think is key, because I think what's happening now is they get this information later on. And as we saw in the last tip cycle, we got it at the very last minute, which caused a lot of the issues that we had. So I think that's key. And I think, I would definitely be supportive of MassDOT doing that, because I think that's essential and probably should have been happening all along. Because one of the things that I know I've asked these questions to proponents when they've come in is, well, why is this, coming up? Why is this coming, and as well, MassDOT's required this, or there was a change in this, or, whatever it is. So I think, but the three possible actions that Matt had on his draft that he sent us was, one, to require projects to have a 25% design prior to being programmed. So that's one question, right? Two is require projects to have an approved 25% project scope, which sounds like what John was talking about, resulting in updated cost estimate prior to being programmed on the tip. And the third item that Matt had was set another threshold for project programming, such as a 25% design submission, regardless of approval status or having completed a design public hearing, which takes place after the approval of 25% design plans. So I think, Eric, I think those are the three choices that we're kind of looking at right now as far as to answer this first intervention question, correct?
Yeah, and it could also be all of those things, I think.
Yeah.
Right, Matt? Those things aren't like exclusive of each other, right?
Well, one
Yeah,
and
so-
two would be, right? It'd be one or two would be one or the other, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, really, sort of what I was trying to outline there is that, you know, there are several steps in project progress that could be the sort of cutoff point. So you could say, you know, pre 25% scope approval, which is not a full 25% submission, but that means that, you know, MassDOT staff have reviewed the scope and cost and have updated it from the PRC estimate. So that would be sort of the earlier end of this spectrum. You know, there's 25% submission. So submission has been made by the proponent, but it may or may not have yet been approved by MassDOT. As you know, as John just noted, you know, MassDOT staff time can be limited for projects that aren't on the tip, and so that approval process could take, you know, 90 days or more. So we could say, you know, a 25% submission has been made, or even from there, a 25% submission has been approved. So it's been reviewed and approved. Or even further from there, you know, sort of the other end of the spectrum would be after a 25% submission has been approved, a design public hearing would happen, and we could say we have to wait till after the design public hearing to get programmed. So there's sort of several steps along the way. It just, you know, it's all sort of a sliding, you know, sliding scale here of how much certainty we want in the cost.
Eric, just the one thing on all three of them though, but I'll ask John Prasad also. I would like to see that it's a definitely requirement that MassDOT has provided that scope, so that the proponents can, you know, obviously do their work with what MassDOT has in mind, so that when they do come up with their 25% design and their cost estimates, they're including the scope that MassDOT sees at that point that's going to be involved in the project.
The scoping meeting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, John.
Well, I want to make sure MassDOT's turning around and say, I mean, I do this, you know, for a living, right? So, you know, we wouldn't start working on even a preliminary estimate without a good scope of work of what we need to do and all the requirements from the different, the different aspects of the project. So, you know, I may need to know about A, B, and C, but I need to have that scope in front of me so that now I can put together real numbers. And I think that's what John, you know, that's what you were talking about, was getting a good scope so that the proponents can actually put together a good estimate, good design based on what your needs are going to be. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. If I don't want to trump anyone else who has their hand raised. Tom, appreciate the perspective. We have an engineering directive that was issued just recently, within the last 6 months, that this has to happen for all projects. So it's not something that we're striving for. It's something that we've put in. Any project that has received, that is in the pipeline, you know, going towards 25%, this is required. And you know, we're reinforcing that. We were doing that internally with our bridge projects. And when I came in front of this group in the past, several years ago, talking about, you know, cost increases, and then most recently, several years ago, we identified which projects experienced the greatest cost increase over the life of the project, over the development of the project. And our bridge program, you know, experienced up to essentially 10% change in cost from inception to construction. And our reconstruction and our trails and those other projects experienced anywhere from 15 to 35% change in cost. It was more about, our bridge project was focused. It was abutment to abutment, necessary approach work and necessary utilities. So the project limits were very focused and a little finite. There could be some, you know, expansion because of an intersection or site distance concern that we needed to address. But in general, we were scoping those in advance and issuing those so there wasn't a significant change in cost over the development of the project. Whereas our roadway, trails, and intersections, as we started to get into the preliminary design, other items were identified. You know, well, an intersection that's in close proximity, or we have site distance, or we had some additional ADA and transit options that we needed to incorporate that were not necessarily looked at the earliest phases of the project when it was originally being scoped by the proponent. So those projects, you know, experienced an increase of cost of that, 15 to 35% in some locations.
John,
Yes,
can I ask you a process just question?
sure.
So once a project gets PRC approval, at that point, does MassDOT say, okay, come back to us when you're ready to schedule a scoping meeting?
When we give approval now, this was done just a few years ago. When we give PRC approval, a letter goes to the community. It's actually quite extensive because there's several attachments and say you need to do it this way. Here's the things that you have to worry about. And now we're adding in this newer engine. We always state that it has to be developed to the MassDOT standards, and we want that to be a live document in case we adopt something. Over time, we want it to become live and not, have to wait for the next issuance of a manual or directive and et cetera. So we do send out a very extensive, package to the community as the proponent and say, these are the things you need to worry about. I mean, it totals upwards of 15 plus pages, I believe, in some instances. And it puts the PRC cost that was proposed, as well as it identifies those contingency costs that we talked about just a few months ago that were, that some people thought were add-ons that MassDOT was thrown on at the last minute to put the project out of constraint. But those things are identified in that package going back to the communities that say you need to account for, the 10% overruns, the construction engineering piece, which is MassDOT personnel and testing, et cetera, that's done as administering the project during construction, and then the traffic police, and then obviously, some form of utilities that may be impacted by the project. And what I've at least found in my career is that sometimes people design to a number rather than to the project. So if they think the project is a $10 million project, they design to the $10 million number. And then it seemed when MassDOT applied the contingency costs that were identified at the earliest phases of approval, now it's $12.5 million because those contingencies add up to about 20 to 25%. And, as I said, just a few months ago, I did that little PowerPoint presentation. We identified maybe it was, upwards of 15 or 20 projects that the cost had changed and how those broke down, what the cost increases were. And it was asked by several members, is this something that MassDOT just added on that, this is kind of a last minute thing? But the communities were alerted, and I don't have copies of that information right in front of me right now, but the communities were alerted at the earliest phases of programming that these were costs that needed to be included within the project. And unfortunately, over time, over development, those costs get forgotten. But at the end, when when the project is now going to final, that stuff is, it has to account for these things. It's always been in the project. And then sometimes overall, the budget is, is higher than.
But I guess what the question I have for you is, so the 25% scoping meeting you have with the proponent, that happens before the submission of the 25% design.
Yes, we'd like it. I think the directive says we'd like to have the designer, the proponent, come in at like the 10% level. You've done some traffic work, you've done the survey, you have enough information so that we can make an informed decision.
And you actually, after that meeting, do you say to them, okay, we approve you now to move forward? Is there an actual approval letter they get, or is that just
I'm not sure, Eric, if there's an approval letter that is, and that's probably just a touch point I'm not aware of because I'm not involved in that specific, piece. But the engineering director says this is what we're going to do, and we're going to agree on the scope. I'll verify that and be able to report.
It's an actual meeting. I guess because the question I think that we have to decide here for this body is, do we want to say we'll only program projects on the tip that have had this 25% design meeting? This 25
pre-25 scope.
Pre-25 scoping meeting. That could be the level that we say we're only going to program projects that have actually had that meeting occur. a higher threshold would be to say, obviously that meeting would have occurred and then they would have submitted the 25% design. So I think that's actually the question. I think we all agree that having the thing actually approved with the public meeting is too far. That's too high of a threshold. I think we're trying to figure out what's the right compromise. And maybe John, I don't know, what is your opinion on that? Do you think just having that scoping meeting is good enough, or do you think it would be even better to have the 25% submission?
Since this pre-25% scoping is a newer engineering directive, not every project that's in the pipeline has gone through it yet. I'd like to say that would be a good threshold for us to focus on, and not get to 25%, or not have to wait to 25% just because of the timing, in the delay. I think that would be a good milestone to maybe shoot for. It's just that it's a newer engineering policy, as I said, this year. And I just want to make sure that the firms and the proponents are aware and are following it. So that way we can make informed decisions about cost, schedule, scoping, and programming.
Okay, that's really helpful, John. Thank you. Len Diggins, you've had your hand up.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Eric. Jay was in front of me, but it seems like he's a little busy now. I ultimately, though, I think regardless of what John has just said, and that was all very valuable, I think we need to discuss how we support communities who need help getting to that 25%. So as Ken pointed out in the last meeting, Ken Miller, that if the MPO helps me, then if the project doesn't move forward, then that money needs to come back to the feds. What I'm wondering is, since MassDOT is so involved in this, thankfully, is there a way that MassDOT can help me with the communities that need the support to get to the 25% design phase? Because the communities that don't have the money, they just don't have the money. And they're going to be left behind if we don't figure out some way to help them.
So Len, I think just to be clear, your question is, can we use these federal dollars to design projects? Is that
no? Because I think
No.
the risk is with that is that if we decide the project isn't going to move forward, then the money has to go back.
Yes.
Right.
So it creates a sort of a web of complexity that we don't want to get into right now.
Right. And even if we say, okay, well, we're willing to put these projects on the tip, at pre-25 or 25, we still need to figure out how to help the communities that can't do the design work. And so I'm trying to find money to help these communities do that. So now my question is, can the state put up that money? It would be non-MPO money, but working with MassDOT, help them get the resources that they need in order to do the design work. Now, this is independent of what the project's going to cost, because the whole design is to help us determine what it's going to cost. But so
I will say a couple things, and then I'd like to turn it over
Sure.
to Ben Mueller for a second. So,
Thanks.
the state does pay for design. Like, there are lots of projects that get design money through the MassWorks program. The Complete Streets program that MassDOT funds, they get design money. There are like kind of other state grant programs that help advance projects along a little bit. There is not a formal pot of money that MassDOT has to say, bring us your projects and we'll design them. But let me see what Ben Mueller has to say.
Thank you. That's it for me too.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I just wanted to pipe in on the design part. I'm not sure if it's always money is the biggest struggle for these communities that are having difficulty making it to the 25% submission. It's at least from what I've seen, it's often a lack of experience designing federal aid projects, a lack of experience with MassDOT's process. If you only do one project every 10 years, it gets on the tip, your entire staff might have turned over in that time and they've never done the process before. And so, like Eric was saying, there is funding available, Mass Trails, Mass Works, from a lot of different sources for funding. And a lot of towns use their Chapter 90 funding to go towards the design element, but a lot of towns don't necessarily have the experience to know how to procure a designer, how to get the funding lined up, how to meet MassDOT standards. So or they don't have the staff to kind of keep up with all the different milestones going on. And so I think one of the elements of assistance that could be helpful is having, sort of that guidance, that shepherding through the process by either MPO staff or by partners within their subregion, or, some system that gives them structure for the process and some guidance for making it through the process, because that might be something that they've never done before.
Well, thanks, Ben. And let's not lose track of that, because I think it's really important. And maybe we need to do some outreach. And I think that comes up maybe in the second point, maybe related to the second points that Matt is going to make about us touching, the communities or the project proponents, and factor that into the budget, because and do some outreach to maybe communities that haven't done proposed projects, to make sure that they just aren't stymied by the necessary complexity of the process. So thanks.
And I would say another thing we could also do, and Matt, I feel like you've also done some thinking about this, is we could actually score people's projects before they've had one of these like milestones we're talking about, so that they know whether their project is competitive at the MPO to even begin with. Because if a project isn't competitive, they might decide, okay, we're not going to invest the time and resources to even try to, advance it further along if it got a low score. Because we have a pretty robust scoring system, and we've been largely funding the projects that score the highest in it, with that sort of geographic distribution of resources screen incorporated, as well. So, a suburban community could understand kind of where their project ranks among other projects kind of within their subregion too. That could be another layer that we add to this, so that, there's the threshold, there's also some like scoring, so people have a sense of how competitive they would be for funds. Let me go to John Romano.
Thanks, Eric. Is it possible either through the UPWP or even through our target money to set aside a small pot of money for training of some sort, or workshops for these municipalities? Because I think what Ben brought up is probably true. They're probably so lost, or they haven't done one of these in so long, that maybe it's the process is like terrifying to them, and they don't even want to attempt it, or they'll say, we're never going to get through this, it's not even worth it. But maybe if we could set something up like that, where we could help them through through it, where we're not physically giving them money. It seems like, I'm just randomly throwing out a number, but like, out of all the money target money that we spend, if we put aside $500,000 for a project like this, look at all the money we might be saving in cost overruns. Or if we had a couple of small communities put in small projects that would never ever make it, it'd be money well worth spent.
I mean, John, even something a lot cheaper could just be that, as part of like the sub-regional meetings we have, we could host a series of like refreshers on the highway design process, and sort of some of these updated standards and processes, and how it relates to the MPO. And that could just be something we do at the sub-regional level. We make sure that the DPW staff attend. That's something that wouldn't necessarily, we could potentially incorporate that into like our outreach in some way between MAPC and CTPS.
I think just having that out there will help encourage people. So we don't just drop it on them that we're changing when you can get on a project to, but we're coming with that is this help, right? We do it.
Yeah.
I think that'd be great.
Ben, do you have another comment or question?
Yeah, I just wanted to toss in real quick for, sort of picking a threshold level for admission to the TIP. one item to keep in mind is that, we can change it in a couple years. I know, like John was saying, the pre-25 scoping meeting's pretty new. So only projects initiated in the last, 6 months might even have that scheduled or as a consideration. But, if we put something in place now in a couple years, if that process turns out to be, a better touch point, then we can always shift to that process. But I think since this is going to be a relatively new thing, we should target something sort of as early as possible in the design stage, just because if we look at the universe of projects, there's not that many, there's a lot of initiated projects versus projects that have actually started moving through the 25% submission status. And that might change once we institute a policy, but there will be a couple of years where there's kind of a gap in available projects.
Are you saying that there are more projects that have submitted the 25% materials but have not had the scoping meeting, or what are you saying?
Oh, I'm just saying that because we don't have a policy at the moment that you have to reach the 25% submission.
Yeah.
It's unlikely that we have a lot of projects that have met that milestone that we'd want to program over other projects that have only just been initiated and haven't met that milestone. And so we have to sort of keep in mind that if we put in a new thing, there's going to be a couple years of, do we actually have projects that meet this milestone that we can program?
So is that a reason why you're saying the scoping meeting is a better, like, lower threshold? But even with that, we might want to push that off.
Yeah, I'd probably recommend just the 25% submission as a threshold, just to get started and see how that plays out for a couple of years and be open to making exceptions.
I thought that was a higher level than the scoping meeting. I'm a little confused right now. I thought that was a higher level of a threshold.
It's a higher level, but I don't think, I mean, John Bashar can correct me if I'm wrong, but
maybe it could be either or.
It could be either or. I just think since the 25%, the pre-scoping meeting, pre-25 scoping meeting is a new requirement. I'm not sure if projects that were initiated a year ago, say, even are looking at that, because it wouldn't have been part of their approval process.
Okay. Thank you. Tom Bent.
Yeah, I was getting a little confused there too, but I mean, I would think that any new project that's, brand new, starting, tomorrow, they're looking for to go forward, we would institute whatever we decide here. So, and if it makes sense that it's, require projects to have approval at pre-25% project scope, then John's gonna automatically, when they get to 10%, is gonna sit down with them, his staff, and, confine, make sure their scope is there and that they understand what they're gonna be required to do by MassDOT. So I don't really see a problem. I mean, if other projects are already in the pipeline, you can't go back on them now, but anything brand new that's starting now, I think whatever policy we decide, we have to make that choice, because otherwise we're just kicking this can down the road more, So, that's where I'm thinking. And as this discussion's going, it sounds like to me, maybe the approval of pre 25% is where we probably want to be. And then just to Len's point about cost, I mean, we're not really looking at, it's a great point, that I understand it, because I've heard this from municipalities, the smaller ones that can't do this. A lot of reasons why they don't, file for anything at the MPO is because of cost, or they just don't think that they'll ever get their project through. So I think your thought, Eric, about pre-scoring is a great idea too, early on, to see how well they would score. And then, but I think the greater MPO will have to, in the state, will have to take a better look at having more funds for cities and towns that can't do some projects because they don't have enough money to do that. But that's really not a question, I think, for us right now. I think that's a bigger question once we decide, what our requirements are. All right.
Yeah. So I'm just recognizing that we're at 11 o'clock right now. I'm hearing consensus and I'd like to maybe get confirmation that I think I'm hearing that there is support that we would institute a policy that a project either has to had a pre 25% scoping meeting, or it has to have submitted the 25% submission to be, to be programmed on the tip. That would be our threshold. It would be either one of those two things.
And just to add to that would be that MassDOT would also already had to have that meeting at 10% with MassDOT to make sure they have the full.
Yeah, that's the pre 20. That is the pre 25% scoping meeting.
Just wanted to make sure that was part of it.
Yeah, that is it. So let me okay, I'll get to Steve Olenoff.
Yeah, so it wasn't clear when we were talking about when a public hearing is being held in the 25%.
That's a higher threshold. That is that is much further along. That's after MassDOT has basically largely approved the 25% and is now having kind of that public hearing level. So we're not proposing that at this point.
Well, I think there needs to be some kind of public meeting before we reach the point where the MPO decides and starts considering it. If there's no public, because when the public meeting, that's where you find out, is there public opposition to the project? Does the public want something more than what you're doing? And that's where the big changes. I have seen projects that were simple and straightforward, and then it went to a public meeting and it came back, costing twice as much.
We should require that for all City of Boston projects, right? No, I'm joking.
Well, they don't have to resolve everything. They should at least have the public meeting so you can figure out what you're up against. And I think that's got to be a requirement. It doesn't have to be one of those formal meetings. I mean, my town is already, is looking at a project. They've already had a public meeting at the 0% point to gauge, how the people like it. I think that has to be done. That has to be in there.
That's it. Okay. Thank you for that comment. Len,
it was to that point. I agree with Steve about the necessity of having some public input. I guess the question is whether it is that the MPO mandates it or the MPO strongly advises when we are having these discussions with them about the design getting to 25%, that they have that public input, because I would think any municipality that has staff members been around would know that when a project meets the public, is when it's going to go in directions that they probably haven't anticipated. And even if they have, it's still going to be a interesting process from that point on.
Yeah. So just in terms of trying to move us along, because there actually are two other policy recommendations that we want to talk about. I'm hearing, please raise your hand if you don't, if you want to talk more, you don't support the idea of our threshold would be, you have to either have had that 10% pre-25 scoping meeting with MassDOT or submitted the 25% design materials. Okay, I think we have support for that, Matt. Why don't we now, you've written that up to some extent, but we would put that into maybe some more detail. And then I think there's definitely support for having the MPO be able to score some projects like at the PRC level so that communities would know where they stand. So maybe we can think about, how we would include that into, this as well. And then let's think about also, once whatever recommendation we come up with, we could do some type of UPWP roadshow and incorporate an update on sort of the design process as well. Tegan, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking a clarification question, I'm not sure if everyone else felt aware of this, and Matt might be ready to talk about it too. That pre-25% scoping meeting, at that point, has the cost changed at all from the PRC approved cost? Because I was just curious as to whether you think you would have a better sense of the cost of the project at that point.
John, can you answer that at the end of that meeting?
At the pre-25 scoping meeting, we look at the PRC documents, we meet with the proponent, and we discuss other items that we feel may or may not be included. And at that point, we may expand, the scope may be expanded or clarified so that they can move forward with 25%, but we don't necessarily do a new cost estimate at that point, but we at least take what has been submitted, discuss it, and say if we feel that they've addressed everything, because we would look at other data taken as we may get from, from your team, on traffic volumes and crash clusters and growth potential, and say, these are things that really were not clearly articulated in the PRC submittal. And we want to make sure that you're accounting for these in your 25% design, but we don't do a new cost estimate at that point. We may at least weigh in qualitatively that these may include, or this may increase the cost because we're adding things to the scope, or we may be subtracting things from the scope or clarifying things in the scope, but we don't specifically calculate a new estimate at that point.
Thank you. I just thought that was a useful clarification in this conversation.
No, I think so as well. Thank you.
John Romano?
John, question for John Bouchard. At that scoping session, can we be, do you check to be sure that they have not designed to the, say, 10 million, and then I'm gonna add the contingency, not the contingency, but the, the other costs, or that they've actually, the 10 million is like all in?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of splitting hairs on it at that point, John, because it's so early in the process. Again, it's more about if the community is looking at additions to a project or not including something, and we identify that there's been a deficiency in this location, or there's a new development, just outside the project limits that's going to contribute to traffic. We just want to make sure the proponents are aware and clarifying the full scope. And we, at that point, yes, we would remind them that this is what's been approved, and that, one of the policy that MassDOT has instituted is that when the cost in scope, changes by, and I think it's, upwards of 25%, we may send it back to PRC for rescoping if there's a need to do so. Unless that during the development of the design, there were pieces added that expanded and that we were signing off on during that phase. But if a project just shows up at the next phase of design with a significant change in scope and cost increase, then, we may ask that to go back to PRC for rescoping with that team. Not to further confuse the matter, but just we do go through it. We remind them this is what's currently programmed. These are the items. And we would at least try to clarify that with these additional pieces of the project that we think should be accommodated here, we think the cost is reasonable, or, you should revisit this at prior to 25 or something to that effect. So we do at least have that discussion, but we may not have a formal lockdown of the dollars at that point.
We just need to be careful, because we may not be any closer to the real price at that point.
Right, but at 25%, I mean, I realize that, but the biggest thing is when the scope significantly changes, and as this, don't want to go back in time, but as we started today's meeting, the most significant change in cost generally occurs between PRC and the 25% design. And we're just and that's because once they submit their 25s, if they hadn't had a pre-25 scoping, then our team, while they're reviewing, says, hey, this needs to be added, this needs to be included, that needs to be taken out. And that's why the cost changes so drastically. But if we have that pre-25, we're hoping that we address that stuff earlier in the process, and then designing to the actual scope that was submitted and agreed to versus, something significantly different.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it does raise a good question of, right, just from a purely a process standpoint, will that discussion kind of trickle through in terms of a number, in terms of programming? And I think what I'm hearing from John Bouchard is that he's saying it's not like there's some there's not some letter that then changes the number that then is going to go, but that it's definitely, they're catching things, and it's better than what we're doing now.
Yes, it is better than what we're doing now.
So I guess, again, we're trying to find a compromise where we're not creating such a high threshold that people have to invest tons of money and then find out that they're not, that they don't score well, or they're not getting on the tip, or that MassDOT is not giving them the attention that they need because they're not programmed on the tip. We're trying to find that sweet spot. And I think what we're saying here is you either have had that 10% pre-25% meeting, or you've actually just submitted the pre-25 because this is such a new policy, you haven't actually been able to do that yet. That's gonna go a long way to addressing these issues. Okay, so I think we have consensus on that one. Matt, how do you feel about this? Can we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, but I think what I'm hearing is that even if basically there either needs to be some level of confirmation that the PRC cost estimate, confirmation from MassDOT staff that the PRC cost estimate is reasonably accurate, or an updated cost estimate based on scope changes. And that would be sort of the threshold, whether that's happening with the 25% submission or the pre-25% meeting. But there needs to be basically some sort of secondary analysis of the cost. And I think that's what I'm sort of hearing there. So I think, and then, I think the second part of this, MPO staff support for sort of clarifying the steps in the process, and then helping proponents, with some sort of how-to workshops or other elements. I think those are certainly things that then we can, I think staff would be supportive of, and I think ties, nicely into this next segment, which, yeah, I'm happy to jump to if folks are ready.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Okay, sorry, just a second. Yeah, so in terms of increasing TIP stakeholder communications, the recommendation here is really multifaceted. So changes to these communications over and above what is currently happening would involve establishing biannual check-ins between MPO staff, project proponents, and MassDOT staff on project status. So this would be over and above sort of day-to-day communications that we currently have with proponents when folks reach out with questions or other things. But we would be sort of, established timelines saying, hey, it's, July, come check in with us, let us know how things are going. A second component of this would be encouraging project proponents to include MPO staff on any design submissions to MassDOT. That could also include some of the steps that we just talked about, such as, setting up a pre-25% meeting, just make sure MPO staff are informed that these meetings are happening and sort of, abreast of the conversations there. Third component would be requiring that project proponents actually come and present to the MPO when there are major cost or scope changes to their projects. So this would apply to projects that have already been selected for programming by the MPO, at whatever threshold we've decided to set. And then there's a major change from there. And we would, the current process is really that proponents may or may not make a public comment or send some sort of letter. But this recommendation would take it a step beyond that and say a proponent actually needs to, put together some sort of presentation to let the MPO know why their costs are changing, why their scope is changing. Sort of, is it based on public feedback? What are the changes? What's really driving these cost changes? Because I think that's a question that clearly came up a lot this spring and in prior years. Just questions from the larger board on what is happening with projects, and so this would help address some of that. And then the fourth component of this would, and this ties into the conversation we just had, would be to create additional supporting materials to help guide project proponents through the TIP process. So this would be both sort of supporting materials on the specific Boston MPO process and the things that we're looking for and the steps that we have, and then also, tie that back into MassDOT's process and say, like, this is how all the pieces fit together. So proponents know who they need to be communicating with at which steps, and sort of, have all of the pieces there lined out accordingly. So the recommendations on this slide as a whole would support better TIP stakeholder engagement without necessarily requiring significant additional MPO staff time or resources. That's really something we need to be mindful of here, recognizing that those resources and time can be limited. So just jump to a couple of questions here that I think we need to consider when thinking about any recommendations on stakeholder engagement. The first is, should certain actions be required of proponents? And if so, how should this be enforced by the MPO? So should we absolutely require that project proponents come and talk to the MPO if they have a major scope change? And if they don't come and talk to the MPO, what happens? Second question here is, do MPO members desire more regular project status updates? And really, what is the best format for this information? So, if staff are checking in with project proponents twice a year outside of the sort of normal, MPO TIP project selection process, do board members want to receive a summary of that information in some way, or what is the sort of, best format for members to keep tabs on projects as they develop? And is this even sort of interest? So I will stop there and open it up.
Tom Ben.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Matt. On the recommendations that you said, I would support all of those. On the first one, the only thing on the additional check-ins, like you got biannually, the only thing is I might make that check-in more project specific. Some projects may need, the MPO staff to check in with the proponent a little bit more often, depending on the project. But I think overall that's great. And then on the questions for consideration, as far as I think the proponents, especially if they want projects, they should come in and talk to us about it. It's always been amazing to me. Sometimes we'll even at one way I kind of miss the old TIP days, because you actually got to see everybody, even though it was a grueling process. But I've been amazed though when a proponent doesn't even bother to come in to talk to us about it. So I think there should be a requirement that they come in, give us an outline of what their project is. And I think if there is a major scope change, which I know you get into in your third intervention, whatever we determine what that threshold is, they should come in to talk to us about it so that we understand what it is. And as a member, I'd like to get, fairly regular updates, and we could decide, what that timeline would be on these projects as they're kind of flowing through that process. So real quick, I didn't want to spend a ton of time on that, but I just kind of wanted to kind of go over, what I thought. But I thought this piece, you really, did a nice job putting that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Len Diggins.
So a question to Tom, Mr. Chair. So Tom, would it be okay if they submitted their updates in writing? Because it's not like our meetings are short. I'm trying to imagine our meetings if the proponents are coming in, semi-annually, or whatever, to give us updates.
Hey, see, Len, you weren't around when they had the TIP days, and they had to wait around all day. Just to, I personally would like to see them to come in, because sometimes you have that back and forth on process as they're explaining their proposal. Things come up during that where if you're just getting some written report, I'm not sure how much you're getting into it.
And just to be clear, Tom and Len, are you referring to point number 3 here, when projects go up in cost, or just projects in general that are coming before the MPO for TIP funding?
My end is if they're coming before the MPO for TIP funding.
Okay.
I think we should have at least, to me, that should be a pretty low threshold to, hey, they got to come in and advocate for their project, right? And that's typically how it's always been done, especially when we had the TIP days, because we wouldn't even consider a project if they didn't come in to see us. So,
yeah, obviously most do it and during the public comment, but we don't have like a policy that says you have to.
Right. Yeah. And that's part of what this question is asking,
Yeah. Yeah, Len, so you would say writing is good enough for you?
Well, I was asking Tom,
Okay.
so I mean, I read a lot, so writing would be good for me. And then if I needed to have more information, either me submit the questions in writing and get a response back in writing, or then bring them in. I mean, maybe if we did have a day that was devoted to this, then that could work instead of me maybe, because I can see our meetings now. I mean, going from 3.5 hours to 4.5. I mean, I just kind of question how good we are. I mean, after 4 hours, but I mean, it's just a question. I'm not
Yeah.
taking in a strong position. And
I mean,
and
Len, you weren't, I'll tell people, for folks who weren't around 10 years ago, I'm looking at Tom, I'm looking at Steve Olnoff. We devoted 2 8-hour days. And when I say 8-hour days, I mean like starts at 9, finishes at 5. Maybe we had a lunch break. I can't remember. And everybody and their, mother came in and presented on projects, and we gave everyone like 10 minutes. And it was, I don't say it was very productive, because there were just so many back to back, and it felt very consultant driven. And there were projects that were all over the place. I see Rich just popped in. I'd love to get Rich's perspective on this, because Rich was one of the consultants who presented a lot. But maybe it's time to reconsider and do something where we go back. But I would advocate for something that's not as long as those days. And I think just after a couple hours, people were just, their eyes were kind of, glassed over. So
yeah,
Eric, on my end, I'm not advocating for tip days. I just think, and I think because projects come up, over the whole year. I'm just thinking if it's just a different level of commitment. If somebody has to come in and do a brief presentation on their project, and at some point, and I'm willing to kind of go wherever the board wants on this, because the last thing I want to do is have tip days again. Trust me. Because just the material that we had to go through, just to kind of be up to speed on that. But I was just thinking, if the project's getting to a certain point, they should really come in and talk to us about it at some point. I'm not saying, that they have to do it before they can even submit, but at some point along that timeline, they should really come in, so that if we have questions and whatever, we can ask about it. That's all.
Yeah.
Well, certainly if there are scope changes, and cost changes, increases, of course, that I think they should come in and talk with us. And the enforcement is simply, if we don't know why things are happening, and you're, in maybe 2 years out, you may stay 2 years out, because, we need more information and more reason to continue moving you forward in the programming.
Yeah,
That's it.
Len, I agree with that. Especially if there's a major cost increase, yeah, they got to come in.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Rich Benevento.
Thank you for allowing me to offer some comments here, right? So I also go way back. And I do recall coming in for tip day. I also recall that we used to do tip updates, and so this actually goes to both what Tom and Len are asking for, because we used to do a very detailed tip update, and you talked about where the project was and project readiness and cost and all of those sorts of things. And I do recall coming in for those grueling days, and we'd be there all day long, and you'd be presenting. I think there is some justification in terms of, look, if you have a major project and you're not coming in to advocate your project, then how important is it really to you, right? I guess that may be where Tom's coming from. But I think for the MPO, and having been to many of your meetings over many years, I always look at it as what's really important to you folks. What's important is project readiness, and what's the cost. And so what is the best way to sort of broadcast that information so that you guys can make informed decisions about what's going I think this committee was actually formed because projects were going over budget, right? They were going over what was the programmed value. I think that Deputy Chief Rashad and MassDOT is aware of, informing the consultant community, certainly, that, it's not just the office estimate, it's all those other things at the end, that 30% additional cost that's being added to the job that in large measure is pushing some of these jobs over the program value. I guess my question is, what's the best way to get information to the MPO so that you folks can make these informed decisions? And more importantly, at what point is it important to get you that information? If the project, if there's no scope creep, but the project's been languishing for 8 years, and we know some projects last that long, if not longer, then whatever the programmed amount was 8 years ago is maybe a lot different now, and it may exceed what that inflation value or factor that you guys use to add to the project. I mean, all you have to do is look at the last couple of years. If we're adding 4% inflation per year, or however much you're adding, is it 4, Eric?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, it's 4. I think if we look over the last couple of years, especially during COVID and all of the stuff that affected that, 4% is woefully too low, right? I mean, we're seeing that. So, I guess the $50 question here is, how often and what information is necessary for the MPO to make informed decisions? It may be that, that maybe they're quarterly updates to the MPO. I'm not sure what that is. I know that the cities and towns that I represent, we're here I'm here at these meetings specifically for those reasons and to make sure that their projects remain a priority. Should that be a requirement of the consultant community if they're representing cities and towns? Should they be there? I've been at meetings where the mayor comes in of some town, hat in hand. Gee, we really want this project. We really need to move it along. And they haven't even got to the 25% design phase, and they want it on this year's tip. That's an education process, in my view. That they need to be educated about this stuff. So I could go on and on and on, obviously, but and I don't know if I offered any help here, but I think that the big question is, how often and what information do you need? And I don't think it's a question of whether it's in person or on a piece of paper. I think it's a question of what is that information that's necessary for you folks to make informed decisions, and how often do you need it? I'll
Yeah,
yield.
no, that's a good point.
Good point.
Eric, could I ask Rich one question?
Please.
Rich, it's John. We started off the first part of the meeting that there's a significant change in cost in projects from PRC to 25% approval. And what I offered to the group is that, PRC approval is the proponent's thoughts on the project scope and cost, and that when we get to 25%, it's MassDOT's input on the scope and cost. And that, they don't, no, never the twain shall meet on occasion. But I also described the pre-25% engineering directive that was issued this year to conduct that pre-25, 10% level project meeting, scoping of the project, so we can get clarity on from PRC to 25% of what the actual scope is gonna include. Any thoughts or input you can offer in that regard?
Yeah, I think for many years and for large measure, the cost of the projects at PRC may have been artificially low because they didn't want to scare the pants off anybody and get their project approved. I mean, that may have been some of it. I think that the estimates at PRC are, I think they're back of the envelope. I mean, obviously you're looking at major items, but you don't have the details of subsurface. You don't have the details of utilities. You don't have the details of, for example, complete streets may have a certain aspect of the project that's going to require that 37 utility poles get moved. So you don't have all of that detail. I know in the past that some projects have been programmed on the MPO, before the 25% design was actually submitted. That's a little bit Russian roulette, I guess. And I say that, sort of because I have some projects right now that are programmed and we're in preliminary design. I think the consultant community and the proponents have to be honest with what the cost is. And you can look at, there are enough projects out there that you can look at the history. I mean, if you have an urban downtown project that all you have to do is look at it, you have a pretty good idea of what the linear cost per foot of that project's going to be. Years ago, it used to be, $350 a foot back in the urban systems days. Now those projects are probably $200 to $2,500 a foot. It's a lot different. And so you just have to be honest with that, I think, when you're looking at it. I think the other thing too is, I think the pre-25 requirement now, that sort of that 10% review, that the directive that came out from Mass DOT, I think that's vitally important at this point because everybody needs to be on the same page. And I think oftentimes what the community may be looking for may be a little bit different than what Mass DOT is going to require. Secondly, there may be things in that project that the community think are going to be included as allowable participating costs when they're really not. Right. Case in point, street lighting, for example. That's always one that comes up. Is it an allowable cost or is it non-participating? What is it? So I think that at this pre-25 is going to really flush out a lot of that and hopefully get us to better pricing even when the 25s come in. And one other thing I want to add, John, to that is that we may have a very good idea at 25 what that cost is. And we're all in agreement and we get to 75 and guess what? That cost just changed again because now we're into even more details of the project. So I think part of this is trying to estimate as best we can, but also recognizing that there needs to be a reasonable and effective contingency that's added to the project. I think we have to do that because we're going to find ourselves short on every project. I don't know if I answered your question, JB, but that's
you did. I wanted to make sure that because a lot of those on the call are not experiencing that firsthand. Right. You're at least having been doing this for a long time, like myself, have seen projects change. And just from the data that that was conducted prior to the meeting about the change in cost, pre-25, again, as you said, I think is the community's idea of what they think the project is. And then we get to 25% and it's MassDOT introducing, complete streets elements that maybe were not factored, or we've identified utilities and now we're starting to think about subsurface and more detail is available to make a more informed decision. But having us be on the same page at a pre-25, at least all marching to the same beat, there can still be a cost increase. I understand that. That things can happen. There's unforeseens, but at least having everyone at that pre-25 saying, this is what the project scope is, and this is what we're following is a key point so that we're working in partnership and collaborative versus, they have a completely different view, the proponent, than what MassDOT does. And then we see a disparity and then we're fighting that cost the whole way to final.
And one other thing I want to add to this as well is oftentimes when we get to that point, then the next thing you know, we have sort of the legislative delegation getting involved and saying, well, why can't we do this? And now everybody's sort of pitted against each other, why we can't do one thing and why we can't do something else. And I think that's important as well, because we can say, oh, that doesn't happen. That happens, right? The state rep or the state senator is calling saying, well, why can't we do this? And we all have guidelines to follow. So,
thank you both. Appreciate this. Ken Miller.
Thank you, Eric. Just one point of clarification. That 4% inflation is a standard recommended federal highway, but nothing prevents MassDOT or the MPO of doing an analysis and proposing something different. That's up to you.
That's a good point, McCann. Thank you. That's good to remember.
Yes. Secondly, well, it's originally proposed as sort of a minimum because people were not considering it before. So, but if it makes sense to do something different, that's.
Years ago it was 3%, and then you guys increased it to 4%.
Right. So So that's up to you. Secondly, I would be careful about, I think this idea, this 10% review, I don't know why you would consider anything before that happens. Because the peers, like Rich said, what is the incentive for any proponent, whether it's MassDOT or a district office or a municipality or whomever, to fully, to err on the high side, when they're doing this, there's no incentive. So why even, I don't understand why that 10% review can't be bundled. Why don't you do that when you're looking at PRC? Because I understand that approval of PRC allows MassDOT to charge time to a project. But if there was some way to have that happen, then not have actual notice to the town that their project was approved by PRC until that 10% thing happens, so you really know what, you have a better estimate of the cost. Maybe there's some change to the PRC process that can happen to incorporate that 10% review to sort of make things work a little bit better early on. And thirdly, I would just say Rich raised a very good point about unit costs. This is something I've been saying at the risk of sounding like a broken record for those people who remember what that may be. You have to be careful about only focusing on cost increases or scope increases. You may have a project that is a bad project because for whatever reason, the unit costs are really high. You need to have an understanding of why that project, this project is $10 million a mile and when your normal average is $4 million a mile. Those are the kinds of questions you should be asking. And until you get a handle on what some kind of cost effectiveness or unit costs, I think you're missing the boat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Len.
Appreciate those comments, Ken, and I think we can get at that, with our metrics. But with respect to the update, the more I'm listening to this conversation, I'm really now leaning strongly towards those updates being written, at least initially, and then we can bring people in if we want them to give verbal comments. And I think it'd be good also if we kind of if we took a written update and gave that to either a member of the board or a couple members of the board for them to do the review, and then tell the whole board whether or not we should bring people in. Because we just bring people in, either we're going to get no comments because some of these projects are just foreign to us, or we're going to have a few people like moi, dominating the conversation. I'd like to kind of
Are you talking about cost increases or just all projects?
Well, we're talking about the cost increases, or the recommendation that we bring people in to talk about the projects.
When they go up in cost,
yes,
you're okay with it just being a written update?
Yes, I think that should be the initial way that information is submitted, and then we request that they come in if we have to have them, explain further.
Okay. Can you go back to the previous slide, which had the four kind of points? Rasheen or Kate? Or
I think
Matt?
it's the forward slide from here.
Is it forward?
Yeah,
Okay. Establish biennial check-ins, encourage proponents, require proponents, presentations. I mean, I guess my feeling is I really think when a project goes up in cost, you have to come in and you have to talk to us about it and you have to present and tell us about it. If you don't do that, to me, that would be, if we don't ever get that, that could be a reason why we don't fund the increase or take some, I would think we would want those folks to come in person.
Well, I could be fine with that, but the check-ins, I would like to, I think those should be written, they don't have to just come in.
Well, that's why I would look for staff on those check-ins. I mean, that could also be a virtual meeting or a phone call or something like that. Tom, you have your hand raised.
No, I agree with you, Eric, as far as, yeah, definitely want them to come in if there's a, a significant cost increase, which we can, I know we're going to talk about in item 3. On the initial one, when they're proposing the project, maybe it's, obviously we would normally get something written anyway. And maybe the compromise here is dependent on the size of the project. If it's a very large, complex project, do we want them to come in and give us a more detailed thing? But maybe what we could do as a compromise, we could at least, we get the written information, staff gives us a presentation on what the project is. And then at that point, the board could decide, hey, you know what, we want the consultant to come in and the proponent to give us more detail. So I'm fine with that, but I think if there's a major cost increase in whatever we decide what major is, the proponent should definitely come in to explain themselves as to why that happened, because what we're trying to do here is stop scope creep. And, we want them to start realize that this isn't just an endless bucket of money, that, at some point we're going to pull the plug. And so I think if people know that, they're less apt to keep adding things to the project or whatever. So,
or at the very least, that they will be held accountable to explain in front of the board. I mean, it might be that they say, after review and and blah, 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 we decided to add these other components, and we all agree that those are all really great, important things. But they know that they're going to be held accountable to come and talk to us about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah. Rich, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that goes part and parcel with cost is project readiness. And I think because the longer the project lasts, the more that cost is going to go up. So if you're looking for an explanation as to what, this is just my opinion, if you're looking for an explanation as to why costs went up, part of that discussion also has to be project readiness. Where are you with the project? Is your right-of-way done? Is where are you with the design? Are there design exceptions that you waiting for? All of those things need to be part of that discussion because they're all going to affect the cost of the project. So that's just my opinion. I know in projects that we've been involved with, particularly, large scale projects, the 20 millions and up, you really need to have that discussion, and that needs to be part of, in my view, that explanation as to not in addition to cost, but project readiness.
No, I hear you. And I think we're all accepting, I think everyone on the MPO accepts that project costs will change, will go up. I think what we're trying to do is just put it as best procedures as possible, that from the get-go, we're getting a decent project estimate. I think the feeling is that we're getting projects programmed on the tip that are too fresh, and they're not at a level of design where we have a decent project estimate. I don't think we're saying we want 100%. We never want to see a cost increase ever. We understand that stuff's going to happen. We just want to try to get it a little bit in the front. This policy is about now just keeping tabs on things so that there's a little bit of accountability established, that we're hearing from projects, we're getting more check-ins, staff are getting more regular check-ins. I think there's consensus on all of these 4 things. If folks feel otherwise, let me know. But I think this is pretty good, Matt. And I think we can, if folks feel good about this, I forget how long this meeting is planned for. Kate, are we going to 12:30 or are we going to try to wrap up at noon?
11:30 it was.
It was 11:30? Oh my
Yep.
God. Okay.
Right on schedule.
I know we've already lost a few people. Let's go to the third one, because the third one I think is the most controversial, which is basically trying to establish a policy of when projects do go up in cost, of rescoring them and reevaluating them, and potentially even not committing to them. So Matt, why don't you go to that?
Great, thanks, Eric. So the third recommendation, as Eric just noted, is to establish a clear and consistent policy for rescoring projects when costs or scope change beyond a specified threshold. So any rescoring policy should also include a defined set of impacts that rescoring could have on program projects, including things like whether projects should be delayed to a later fiscal year, removed from the TIP entirely, or limited in how much additional MPO funding they can access. So this recommendation is intentionally pretty high level, as MPO staff really needs further guidance from this committee on a number of questions before more detailed policy can be drafted here. And so the next 2 slides have some questions. These are all, again, in the memo that was posted for today's meeting. But these are sort of all of the components that would need to be addressed in order to have sort of a full process for rescoring, if that's something that this committee would like to advance. So some of these questions include, what cost increase should trigger a rescoring? Second question is, should cost effectiveness scoring be used to evaluate across projects or within projects? A lot of these things build on the discussion that we had at our last meeting around cost effectiveness scoring. And something that came up earlier today, but has also come up in previous meetings, is how should cost effectiveness be measured? Should we be looking at cost per point in the MPO scoring, cost per unit, or cost per user, some other measure like that? And are there any projects exempt from rescoring? An idea that was raised in previous meetings is that really high scoring projects may be exempt from some level of rescoring if they do such a great job, meeting all of the MPO's goals, and they score above a certain threshold. Some additional questions here. One of the questions that came up last time is that the TIP programming process in February and March, or February through early April every year, is pretty time constrained. And we all know that things get fairly chaotic. And so at what point in the annual TIP process should any rescoring happen in the event of a major cost or scope change? Does it happen simultaneously with these other decisions in the spring? Or do we, make that happen at some other point in the TIP process? I think one of the questions that came up at a previous meeting as well is, the sort of tension between qualitative and quantitative aspects of rescoring. Are we just, applying the MPO's TIP evaluation criteria again and looking at the cost, coming up with sort of a firm number of the relationship between those two things? Or, is there sort of place for sort of more qualitative assessments by MPO members on sort of what's going on with the project and whether or not the numerical rescoring value should be the key driver of decisions. And again, is there a threshold beyond which a rescoring would trigger some sort of action? Again, projects being delayed to a later year, removed from the TIP, et cetera. And what would those actions be? So I think there are a number of questions here, but it's really sort of at a higher level, does this committee want to advance some level of rescoring in the event that projects change? And then if so, what would that look like? And what would the outcomes of that process, the desired outcomes of that process be? So it's sort of a lot all packed in there, but.
So I think this is an important thing for us to really think about right now. Well, we can do anything. There's nothing that prevents us from saying we're not going to fund an increase, or we can take projects off the TIP. We can do that. We've never really done that before. We don't have really a precedent for it. And if we were to do it, it would be pretty subjective, and I think would be, I think it would be very difficult. I think right now we've just always committed to a project. And I think even establishing a loose policy, even if it wasn't something that was like very specific, even if it was a loose policy that said, look, when projects go up by a certain amount, we're going to reevaluate them. And the MPO can either continue to commit to them, they can not fund the increase, they can take it off the TIP, just putting it out there as saying, we're now establishing that we'll do that, and we will develop some way of trying to objectively evaluate projects against each other. That alone could create a little bit of fear and accountability for projects to want to be following all the things that we're talking about. So I'd love to get people's kind of perspective on this. John, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to just clarify that before we do any cost assessment, let's make sure that the cost being discussed includes those contingencies that should be included. As I said, sometimes proponents design to a number and if a project is programmed at 10 million and they come in at 10 million or 12 million and we're assessing it because it's a percentage increase. But I just want to make sure that when we go to assess the scoring or the cost, that the contingencies are included in that number. So that way we're not making an adjustment and evaluating and then still having to add the contingencies on afterwards. Cause then we're just not solving, we're not solving the problem. That's all.
So just to be clear, my understanding is that for all projects, you scope it out and then there is a 10% contingency. Is it 10%?
No, there's three items that are added on to a project. There's the 10% contingency for overruns. That's that amount is just in, quantities changed. Instead of 50 feet of pipe, we're putting in 60 feet of pipe or something. Then there's the 10%. There's a sliding scale for construction engineering, which is between 5 and 15%, depending on the size of the project.
Okay.
And then there's the traffic police cost.
Okay.
And we generally use, just for argumentative at the beginning and as part of the PRC approval, 10%, 10%, 5%, so that it's generally about a 25% item or 25% contingency, which includes the overruns, the construction engineering, and traffic police. And that's what's included in the PRC letter to the community when they
what we do is, so that's like if that was today, that's in 2021 dollars or 2020, fiscal year 2022 dollars. If we're programming that in 2026 for every additional year, we increase that by 4%.
4%, right?
4% compounded. So not only are those contingencies baked in, but now we're compounding that.
Yeah, inflation factor, sure.
Inflation, but 4% every year. So I guess I would just say is, absolutely. Let's make sure all those contingencies, I guess I look to you all to make sure that that's included in there. I mean, I feel like.
Well, it's just that, the question, if you could go back one slide, that, the first item said, because I didn't write it. What cost increase should trigger a rescoring? I just want to make sure that we have that the cost and whatever the year is that we're all talking apples and apples. That's all, Eric. So that way we're talking if it's a 2025 and it has 3 years of inflation on it, and then it has the 25% contingency for construction, overruns, and traffic police, plus the inflation. So that way we're talking about a cost, instead of being 10 million, it may be 18 million or something like that. Just so that way we're solving the problem. We're trying to solve it one time or discuss it one time. And then when are we, is that a rescore trigger?
Well, and I think you've raised this point, is that there might be some misunderstanding, but like when people see when a designer sees a project programmed in 2026 at 20 million, they think like they're designing a $20 million project in 2022.
Yes.
And like that's where they're like that they should be designing not to the programmed thing in the tip in year 26, but they should be designing to what the project cost is today.
Yes.
Yeah. Tom.
No, that was that helped a lot. Again, I have always assumed that all that contingency money was baked in before we saw it. So we want to make sure that is all there. And then, like Rich said earlier, and I've been banging this drum for a long time, that I've felt that the 4% increase, for year to year, hasn't been enough for a while. And I think, again, it's probably not up to us on what this committee's doing, but I think at the MPO or MassDOT should take a look at that to say, especially right now, we've seen, huge inflations and you can't even get PVC conduit right now. That's how bad it is. Lumber went up, a huge amount of money. It's starting to drop back down again. But, but I think that those contingencies have to be looked at and increased, and it should be based on something, but I've felt that for a long time. So, and again, I agree with what Eric was just saying about making sure that all this is in, and that the proponent understands how all that works so that when they're putting their project together, and the consultants, they understand what MassDOT's looking for. And that should be a thing that when it's being reviewed by even our staff, MPO staff, that's one of the checklist items. Did you include this? Is in there? So that, it doesn't even get to us until somebody's looked at it and said, yes, all those boxes are checked off.
Tom, what do you think about rescoring a project?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's almost like, so, the other thing was like percentage, Matt has percent, if there's an increase in dollars or a percentage. So I was leaning more towards percentage, but I don't know what that would be. And it kind of depends on what the increase was, I think. If it's an increase because they had project scope and they added, gold painted, bike lanes or something. Yeah, I'd want to know that and say no to it, right? Again, what we're trying to do is prevent, unnecessary scope increase. But we want to get a good project too. And I know things can come up during the design process. I'm having a little bit of a hard time. I was hoping to hear from some other people first on that. But I kind of think it depends on the scope and the scale of the increase and the project type itself. Because if it's a intersection project, something might have went up 20%, but it was because, it really made sense to change the type of lights we're using or whatever. And it's really going to have a value to that project. So, I don't know. We might need to have a little bit more discussion on it.
This proposal is not saying we will not fund increases. Right. This proposal is saying we will establish a more objective process for reevaluating projects. And then if we want to take an action, we will do that using sort of a combination of qualitative and quantitative, analysis is kind of what we're trying to get at. Let me go to Ben Muller.
Thanks, Eric. I guess my question is more for Matt for number 5 about sort of when in the TIP year the cost increases are, or projects are rescored, or cost increases are evaluated. Just trying to think sort of on our timeline. We do the readiness days exercise in the early spring, and so as part of that process, a lot of the costs are really firmed up. There's a lot of work put in to make sure the designers get submissions in, and we review them and have all the information for readiness days. But I know for the Boston MPO, a lot of the cost changes that come in sort of outside of that cycle, because they impact the entire TIP, a lot of times they're kind of held for that process. So I don't know if this is something that, we'd want to do maybe a second full TIP amendment in the fall, looking at sort of what changes have come in, what are the big changes, and then do an evaluation there, or if this really would be sort of independent of the TIP amendment process.
Yeah, I think those are all really good questions. Obviously we do learn about some cost and scope changes throughout the year outside of the normal, February through April peak programming season. And so I guess one part of this question is, do we handle consideration of those sort of as they happen on a rolling basis, or is there some sort of timeline that we want to set at a different part of the year? Perhaps that's around a TIP amendment if we want to formalize that and do sort of a halfway through the year check-in, at the other end of the calendar from TIP programming, to sort of spread things out a little bit. I think part of putting this question on here is just to get a sense of if we want to do something as part of the larger programming discussion in the spring, we just need to be conscious of the time that would take and how feasible that is. And so in setting some sort of rescoring policy, we would want to, not do something that's so heavy a lift that it's not feasible, on whatever the desired timeline is. But I think those are all good questions that we need to continue to have in mind as, we get a sense for what a preferred approach might be.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on that, you know, if we did some type of rescoring, like it has to be really simple if we want to actually incorporate it into the TIP decision-making cycle. Because if it's super complex, we're not going to have the time to be able to do that. And so it has to be something really, really basic and simple if we want to incorporate it into that cycle. Otherwise, to Matt's and Ben's point here, we'd have to like make a decision and then say like, well, that's with an understanding that we're going to amend this thing, you know, a couple months out or something like that. Len Diggins.
I think we should make our decision about rescoring after we decide whether there's going to be any consequences to the rescoring, because if there are no consequences, then I don't really see the point in rescoring, you know. And with respect to the inflation number, I've asked repeatedly about the compounding element and have been told that we do not compound. And so you mentioned, Eric, that it's 4% compounded. My understanding is that we don't compound, so that
Okay.
yeah,
Is that
which
a mistake? Did we compound or not?
I've been told we don't.
No, we don't. It's 4, 8, 12, 16.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay,
Yeah.
my mistake. Thank
No
you for
problem.
correcting
But
me.
but it's a big deal. I mean, in terms of what to expect for the projects that or program in the fourth or fifth year. So that's something we might want to consider changing. If the math is something we don't want to engage in, then we can compensate for that by raising the number from 4 to 5 or whatever. But yeah, I think also these are 8 good questions. I don't know if we can really give them their due. In today, and so I want to propose that we revisit. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think we're kind of running out of time here. So let me get John Romano.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Just real quick, I kind of want to just pick up what Tom Bent said earlier. I think it was Tom. I would want to know kind of what the cost increase was for, more than like what the percentage is. I think that's critical to know. And also, we should know about the cost increase before we get it just as an amendment, right? Because today we just all of a sudden get an amendment to say there's going to be a cost increase. I think we should be able to see that way ahead of time and then be able to weigh in as to whether or not we want to fund that cost increase based on what it is. Thank you.
Yeah. The scenario that I'm thinking about, and hopefully if we adopted the first 2 policy recommendations, we would decrease the prevalence of this, which we've seen in the past couple of years. So I think even just adopting the first 2 policy recommendations would go a long way to addressing it. But we still could have a scenario where we have multiple projects, that have gone up in cost, which throw, the various TIP years out of, out of funding compliance. And we have to do something. We have to either we have to push projects out. To date, we've basically just pushed projects out. We've been successful in being able to change the cash flows of some of the bigger projects that are, funded over multiple years, like the Green Line extension or Rutherford. We might not always have that ability. And I do think we should think about, just what happens when we have multiple projects that go up in cost. In the last TIP cycle, we pushed, I think it was a Norwood project, way out. Why? Why did we do that to Norwood? And it was kind of subjective. It wasn't based on anything. It was just kind of like we just all were like, this seems to work. I just think it would be nice if we had a process where we said, okay, there's 6 projects that went up in cost. We're reevaluating them, and we're going to use the reevaluation to decide how we're going to do things. And we're going to be clear that we have a number of different options. We can continue to commit to projects. We can push them out. We can say we're not funding increases. But this would just be a way of more objectively being able to do that. It doesn't say that we're not going to fund increases. It's just a way of measuring projects against each other. I think a simple way of doing it would be, right now we score projects, a project that gets, say, a 60, we could divide it by its a 60 divided by its cost, and it has a point dollar value. If we rescore it and that 60 goes to a 70, we then divide it by its cost. And we say, did we get more point value for that cost? That could be a way of indicating the value of the increase vis-a-vis our already fairly robust, scoring. That doesn't have to be the only tool that we use to evaluate a project. It can be a number of different factors, but that could be one, very simple way of looking at it. So I think to what Len said, I think we are kind of out of time. I would ask folks to think about this, and I think, we'll bring this to the next meeting, and discuss some more. John, you have your hand raised.
That was from before. Sorry, Eric.
Okay. So Matt, what is left on the agenda? We have some areas for further exploration.
Yeah, so I can just run through those like very, very briefly to just sort of put these ideas on the table for folks to continue to think about, and then we can actually have a discussion about them in the coming week, just recognizing the time. So I think, we have sort of 3 different policy areas that we are looking at and making some changes to. Obviously still need to have some discussion to build on the previous discussion and sort of refine those a little bit further. But some other areas that weren't sort of directly included, but that we may want to also consider as a part of sort of a broader suite of policy changes. Well, I mean, this first one obviously has come up a couple times today. And so we could, consider making a change to the MPO's current practice of adding 4% per year non-compounding cost contingency. Second sort of option here, or sort of outstanding question that really actually cuts across any of the policy changes we're making is, when should they actually take effect? I think Ben brought this up earlier, just noting that, there may be different aspects of policy changes that we may want to take effect at different times to sort of get the impact that we're looking to get. So I think that's something that we should consider in all of these different changes. Then finally, an idea that was discussed a couple of meetings ago, but is not explicitly baked in here, is should we be setting some sort of formal project schedule or benchmark system in the way that the Cape Cod Commission does, where they've got sort of when you're in the 5th year of the TIP, you should be at this stage, 4th year, you should be at this stage of design, et cetera. All of these things are, clearly sort of in complement to the other things we've already discussed today. And then, I would just say beyond these things, if there are other things that we haven't discussed today, maybe they've come up in prior meetings, or maybe you're still just sort of, curious about them, would love to hear those ideas, and those can come to, to the chair and to staff sort of anytime if you want them to be on a future agenda. But I will stop there and just see if there are any questions or comments.
So I think we should hold discussion of these until the next meeting. I think the agenda for the next meeting will be talking about this sort of this rescoring, reevaluation. I think we can talk about some of this. That's probably a good segue into the next agenda item. Yeah. So I think we made some good headway. I think there's relative consensus on these sort of first 2 policy recommendations. I think for the next meeting, we'll now get deeper into the 3rd one. And maybe at the end of that, we can have a consensus recommendation. I don't know. We might have to have another meeting in September, but we'll see how that goes. I know we have well, why don't we go to members items now? Are there any other final points or topics that people would like to raise? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So the next meeting, I believe, is it, I think we said it would be August 19th after the full MPO meeting at like, whenever that is, like 12:30 or so. We'll pick this up.
Yes, Eric, that's what we discussed prior.
Okay, I'm not seeing any objection to that. So that's our plan. We're gonna pick this up on the 19th. And, you know, I'll connect with staff, and there might be some interim things that we might send out via email for folks to kind of chew on and think about. So keep an eye out for that. But this has been great. I think we've made a lot of headway today. This is, you know, this is not easy, but I think this has been a very productive meeting. So I want to thank you all. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Great. If without objection, then we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, today. Really
Thanks, all.
appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Zero.
Meeting.